Hi, my name is Steve Copland and welcome to this study number 4 in our Bible series on the book of Colossians. This study I call Who is Jesus Christ? Part 1. And in this study we're going to be examining the deity of Christ, and in the next study his humanity. We're going to be reading from Colossians chapter 1 verses 15 to 17. And I'd like to just remind you also that if you haven't watched the introductory video to this series, please do, because it's very important that we understand the context in which Paul is writing this letter. Having said that, let's get started, and I will read to you Colossians 1:15 to 17. For he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Throughout the world there is a great deal of confusion about who Jesus Christ is. A lot of that confusion stems from the fact that people refuse to believe something which they cannot intellectually understand. And in this I am referring to the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. The word Trinity never appears in the pages of Scripture, but the idea that it expresses is definitely taught within the Bible. This doctrine defies mathematical logic. It defies definitions and analogies, although many have tried to use definitions from the created world to explain the Trinity. Why, the Creator exists outside of this created world. Primarily, God exists outside of the created world. Therefore, many people such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, like the Pharisees of the 1st century and the Arians in the 3rd century, refuse to believe that God is triune by nature. From the beginning of man's fall and separation from God, people have created their own gods and idols. Now, these were all gods which could easily be understood from an intellectual perspective. Weather gods, fertility gods, etc. But has any human being ever tried to create a God which was impossible to understand? A God that was intellectually indefinable? That would be impossible for a human being. Only God could do such a thing. I have often been asked by Jehovah's Witnesses and others if I understand the doctrine of the Trinity, and my answer is always, no, I don't. How then can you believe such a thing, they ask me. And my answer is, because no man could ever conceive such an idea. Only God could conceive such an idea. Only God could express himself in such a way. But more than this, I believe it because the Bible clearly states this truth. The Scriptures declare the truth of the Trinity, and Jesus Christ has made it known in history and to me personally. Now, these 3 verses which we are about to study contain some of the most profound words ever written by any human being. Some scholars believe that they may have been part of an early hymn, but whatever the case, they are the foundation of all that Paul has to say in the rest of his letter, and they are his answer to the question, who is Jesus Christ? Throughout this letter, Paul will draw our attention to Christ as both God and man, for both are equally important to our salvation. So firstly then, Paul writes that he is the image of the invisible God. Now, our word for image in English may suggest something like a copy, something which is less than perfect. But the Greek text means something closer to the idea of a revelation. Paul is saying then that Jesus Christ is the physical manifestation of God, the physical manifestation of the Father who was invisible to human eyes. John tells us that no one has ever seen God, but God the only Son, who was at the Father's side, has made him known. This is John chapter 1 and verse 18. Notice, please, that John calls him God the only Son. And Jesus himself stated that anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. John chapter 14 and verse 9. The writer to the Hebrews puts it this way: the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3. Now for me, these words are extremely clear, but the fact which they state is still impossible for me to understand. How can someone who created this incredible universe with all of its complexity, its infinite detail, and its perfect design, then become so small to become a part of his own creation? Now, Paul would answer that question by referring to Christ as the mystery which has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the saints. Colossians 1:26. So Paul calls Christ the firstborn of all creation. Protokos passes katasios. The first term, firstborn, protokos, this word has several meanings. Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses claim that this phrase proves that Jesus was the first created being, the firstborn of all creation. Well, they are absolutely wrong. In Greek, the phrase literally means begotten before all creation. But this word does not mean to be created. Rather, it means to exist eternally in a physical form. Now, this term then is Paul's explanation of his first words, the image of the invisible God, the one who has eternally existed in a physical form. Notice also that the word firstborn is connected with this being over all creation. Now, this is another meaning of firstborn, and it signifies dominion over all things, as the first member of the family was heir of all, the one with supreme authority within Jewish culture. Christ's authority, then, is not something given to him by a higher authority, but rather it is absolute. Paul is never suggesting that Christ is the first of all created beings, but rather that he is unique. He is distinguished from all creation because, as he tells us in verse 16, he is the creator himself. Let me read that. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. These words echo the language of Genesis chapter 1 and the Old Testament wisdom literature of Proverbs chapter 8:22 and verse 30. There it says that Christ is the craftsman at the right hand of God, the physical manifestation of God, creating all that has ever been created. And John draws upon the Logos language of Plato to make the very same point in the opening words of his gospel. He writes this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, in Greek, the word that we translate word is logos, and the word for God is theos. Now, this verse has been twisted in a diabolical way by the Jehovah's Witnesses' New World Translation, which reads, and the word was a God, inserting the indefinite article a into a translation from English, a rather sloppy translation from English. Now, there are two reasons why the New World Translation is absolutely impossible. And I'm going to put on the screen for you so that you can read the text yourself to see the original wording of the Greek, and especially the word order in the Greek. So firstly, then, the Greek text reads, and God was the Word, and theos was the logos. It doesn't read, and the Word was God. Our English versions have changed the order in order to make it easier to read. But the Greek is absolutely emphatic that God was the Word, Theos was the Logos. Secondly, there's no indefinite article in Greek, in New Testament Greek. It doesn't exist. The New World Translation is a deliberate mistranslation to deceive and confuse, trying to invent the idea that Christ is a God who created the world. But the Bible categorically shows that this is absolutely in error. John categorically states, as does Paul, that Jesus Christ is God the Creator. God the Son became the Son of God. The second part of Paul's claim in verse 16 is aimed at the heresy in Colossae. Now he writes that Christ created all things, both visible and invisible, and then he gives us a list of beings in a descending order of authority. Now this list includes archangels, lesser angels, fallen angels, and other spiritual authorities. Now here the apostle is laying the foundation of Christ's supreme authority in order to rebuke those people who have been teaching the Gnostic claim of angelic authority. Jesus Christ, Paul is saying, is not an authority. Rather, he is the authority, the one to whom all these others owe their very existence. Why then, he's asking, would any of you choose to obey a lesser authority than the Creator himself? The one who, he says later, has redeemed them, the one who has rescued them from the dominion of darkness. Why would they want to worship an angel when they can worship the one who created the angels? And Paul also tells us that all things were created for him. Now the universe, our world, and every creature has been created for Jesus Christ. These words proclaim the eternal plan of God to glorify himself. The Jewish rabbis taught that the entire world had been created for the Messiah. However, they didn't recognize him when he came into this world, the world that he had made. Everything that has happened from the dawn of creation has been a part of God's plan of salvation, a plan designed to bring many sons to glory, Hebrews 2:10, and to and for the praise of his glory. The Messiah's coming into this world was not some secondary rescue plan after the grand design went wrong. No, rather, the fall was both foreseen and allowed by God, but always under the supreme authority of his control. In verse 17, Paul completes this initial explanation of who Jesus Christ is with these words. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now here again, Paul underlines that Christ as creator is before all things. But in the last phrase of this verse, he draws his readers again into the language of the philosophers, and in particular, Aristotle. Now when you look at a piece of wood, what do you see? A solid, a liquid, a static, or a moving object? Now most people would say a solid, static object. Some would even say a dead object. But what if you could look deeply inside the wood and magnify it to such an extent that you could see the very atoms which make up the wood? Would you not see millions of protons, neutrons, and electrons spinning around at the speed of light at 186,000 miles per second, controlled and sustained at the speed of light by he who is the light of the world? And so it is with everything. What Paul is telling us here is that every atom is held together by the absolute knowledge and power of Jesus Christ. Christ is the ground and foundation of all reality. He is, as Thomas Aquinas stated about 1,000 years later, the unmoved mover, the one who is unmoved, who moves all things and holds them together. The verse that we read from Hebrews in chapter 1 and verse 3 says almost exactly the same thing, that he is the one who sustains all things by his powerful word. Jesus Christ commands every atom to function exactly as it does. How did he turn water into wine? Well, I don't know, but perhaps he simply rearranged the atoms. How did he walk on water? Maybe he rearranged the atoms. How does he heal the human body? I don't know, but maybe he simply rearranges the atoms. He is the Lord of all creation. The Lord of all creation. All creation obeys his will. Every single atom obeys his will. And without his sustaining power, there is no life, there is no world, there is no universe. Every person, every creature owes the very breath in their lungs, owes their very existence to his sustaining power. Those who know and love him should live their lives in holy gratitude and worship. And those who refuse to acknowledge him, as we can read about in Romans chapter 1 and verses 18 to 23. And such people, even though they know in their secret thoughts that God is there, that God exists, and yet they refuse to acknowledge his authority, such people will experience his wrath for suppressing the truth which is manifested all around them. Now, there is a great deal more we could say about the divinity of Christ, but time does not allow. We could talk about how Thomas called him my Lord and my God. But this then, that we have just looked at, is the first part of Paul's answer to the question, who is Jesus Christ? And what Paul is saying, that he is the exact representation of the Godhead, the physical manifestation of the triune God, the eternal one. He is not some created being as the Jehovah's Witnesses and others claim. On the contrary, Genesis chapter 1 could read, in beginning Christ created the heavens and the earth. And John's Gospel in chapter 1 verse 1 could read, in the beginning was Christ, and Christ was with God, and God was Christ. And Paul means exactly the same thing when he says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. It is my hope and my prayer that this Bible study has helped you to understand in a deeper way who Jesus Christ is, and that through understanding that and through acknowledging that you will want to love him and to know him more deeply in your work with him. God bless you.